Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to see you here with us today. And I want to open our discussion regarding the Global Jihad Organization. We have a team here, a huge team, I can say, a very respectful team. So I hope that during our conversation we'll be able to discuss different areas of the theaters of jihad, different areas of jihadi groups, and then we have a answers and questions during our discussion. What we are trying to describe during these discussions, I will start. Every one of the panelists will have around 20 minutes, between 15 to 20 minutes to have his discussion. I will start my presentation regarding the global jihad groups, specifically strategy and operational issues, in general overview, trying to take you back to the bigger story of the global jihadists. My name is Eitan, Azani, as you know. I'm here from the Institute, and I want to continue with our other speakers. The next speech will be by my colleague, William, that he will describe the story of Akam and Isam, the competition and its implication for global jihadists. William is an executive director at National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, Start University in Maryland. We have a lot of connection with this university. Then we will have our friend Rohan, my friend Rohan, that he will discuss the global jihad movement. He is the director of International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research in Singapore. Then we will have Zenn that will describe Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in this quiz and is unmasked. Zenn is analyst of African and Eurasian affairs, and he's from Jamestown Foundation. Then we will have the Yassin that he will discuss the businesses of the Khalif, how strong, how resilient is the Islamic State in economy. And the last, my friend, Rateb Amro, that last but not least, thank you very much for your, I didn't aware of it, radical Islamic movement and regional stability. And I want to start the description of my discussion regarding Al-Qaeda and ISIS goal, policy, strategy, and implementation. And when my students know it very well, but I want to share it with you also, when it comes to the global jihad situation, I usually describe the global jihad situation as a pyramid. And when we are describing the pyramid of Al-Qaeda Central or Al-Qaeda organization, meaning the previous organization or the organization that was old compared to ISIS, we have theaters of global jihad as a base, different theaters of global jihad, Akim, Akap, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Sharia, and others. Underneath, on the second layer of this group, this is the affiliate organization that operates with Al-Qaeda for many years, and they are all over the world. And then we have, during the years, Al-Qaeda established a clandestine terror networks all over the world, in Europe and in Africa and other places. Al-Qaeda is an entity controlled, not a very tight control, controlled by Al-Qaeda Central, that, as everybody knows, isolated in the area of Pakistan, Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda Central had a deputy in Yemen, but this deputy disappeared after he was targeted killing, and now they don't have nominate a new deputy that enabled them to run the organization itself. And also my students know that everything that connects to the global jihad is based on the global dawah infrastructure, meaning the base that enables jihadists to recruit people to their ranks. So we have global dawah infrastructure. But this global Dawah infrastructure served two organizations, not only Al-Qaeda. It served also at the same time. The radical part of this global Dawah organization served the Islamic, the ISIS, the Islamic State. And if we come to the Islamic State, the pyramid of Islamic State is a little bit different. In the base of this pyramid, we have the Islamic Caliphate that was established by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and in the areas of Syria and Iraq. The second layer on the top of the Islamic Caliphate, we have the Islamic provinces and affiliated, meaning when ISIS understood that they need to carry out an operation outside the theaters of operation here in the Middle East, they started to establish a new entities outside this area: Sinai, Boko Haram, Libya, Maghreb, Khorasan, Yemen, Abu Sayyaf group, meaning ISIS, when they established their capabilities on the ground, they started to operate outside the Middle East like Al-Qaeda style. But it didn't end here, because ISIS continued to operate Al-Qaeda style also on Europe's soil and in other Western societies' land, because they recruited people from this area. So on the top of this pyramid, we have ISIS leadership. The main problems of these two organizations that the potential targets, audience of these organizations are coming from the same areas. So they operate the ISIS took some of the audience that are operating with Al-Qaeda and recruit them to the ISIS. So the situation today that the two of them are sitting on the same base, and they have a huge competition between themselves, but nobody can guarantee that within 2 years, 3 years from now, they will work together again after the leaders will decide that they need to change a position. Meaning the situation today that we said we have Al-Qaeda and we have a strong ISIS could change tomorrow morning or within a coming year. Just describing these two organizations, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as I mentioned before, operating based on center of operation and on the other side, circles of operation around the center. So Al-Qaeda have first circle and second circle of Al-Qaeda members, that the first circle connected to the core group of the organization, that this is, as we mentioned it before, Aqab, Akim, Somalia, Syria, and Chechnya area, and also the Indian subcontinent, that Al-Qaeda established a new entity, a new branch last year. But the second circle of this group, these are groups that are operating in Tunisia, in Libya, in Yemen, groups that are operating in Mali, and other group in Kashmir and in Bangladesh. For the Islamic State Caliphate is the center, and around Islamic State Caliphate, we have different groups that are operating around the circles of the Islamic State Caliphate. And you cannot describe stories of different groups, entities that are operating around the world without understanding the concept of the global jihad line of evolvement based on the concept of hybrid terror organization. What do we have within the global jihadists? They started with what we call the Vanguard model, meaning establishing capabilities only to carry out jihad. And that's what they are doing. In most of the cases, jihad is the most important component of our duty, so we will establish a jihadic wing. This is what we face in Al-Qaeda, even until today. This is what we face in a jihadi organization during the line of their development. During the years, Al-Qaeda is central, and even at the beginning, ISIS, based on the terror wing only. The second component that we see it within the Al-Qaeda strategy, and we see it today within ISIS strategy, started to operate within the social sector. Because they understood that these people are the masses that you need to recruit to your organization. So they establish a new capability within the social sector. The last component of it is entering into the political sector. And the situation of ISIS that established the caliphate is totally different than the situation of Al-Qaeda Central that do not have caliphate. When ISIS established the caliphate, ISIS said, I'm entering into, beside being a military component, beside operating within the social network, within the social groups, and within the public, I want to establish a state controlled by Sharia. But this is a state, meaning political order. So we have within ISIS that ISIS themselves enter into the hybrid model, and Al-Qaeda stay in what we call the vanguard model, meaning the model that what they have only today, the terror wing and the social sector, because Al-Qaeda today do not have a territory that they said, in this territory we have a political capabilities and we are controlling. So the differences between ISIS and Al-Qaeda stay. The next component that I want to describe here when it comes to the differences between the organization is the Islamic State 100-year plan. It's an information, we found it from time to time. You publish it, I know, on your website, and it was published also in other websites. But this information regarding the 100-year plan describe what? In the first place, relationship between the entities that run these kinds of organization. The general leadership relationship between military and political wing, a relationship between the ideologist and the other component, and component that connected to the economic situation of this group. Meaning, they have the plan that you can understand based on this plan that they are operating and running a state in their eyes. So they need a plan that shows what is the relationship with this kind of state. But it's not only a plan. When you establish a state, you need to establish a command and control chain. And that's what you can see very clearly, that within the global jihadists, within ISIS, we see a command and control chain, all the components that they enable them to run in areas of operation that they were operating in this area. One command and control chain, another piece of information about the system, a command and control chain in the level of the security of this organization. And you need to understand when it came to ISIS, ISIS is based on the concept of the Iraqi military forces, meaning everything was not just the jihadists that enter in areas of operation and decide to establish something big. It's based on people that this was their duty. They were soldiers during the time of Saddam Hussein. Strategic axis. Strategic axis in the eyes of this organization is the establishment, even Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is establishment of the caliphate and enforcement of Islam over the world. This is the vision of every jihadi group. They want to enforce Sharia and take control over the world. Implementation, interlocking and evolving strategies. Why? What we see these kinds of strategies within the jihadi world during the years. The 7 phases strategy, well-known strategy that target termination in 2020, meaning in 2020 Islam will rule the world. This is the 7 phases strategy. The 1,000 cuts strategy connected, directed into the story of homegrown and lone wolf. We will be able to influence people in different parts around the world to carry out a personal jihad. Small attack that at the end of the day caused the victory. This 1,000 cut strategy combined with other strategy that is called the individual jihad strategy, the global Islamic resistance call, promoted by Abu Musab al-Suri from Al-Qaeda during the 90s and promoted within the Al-Qaeda ranks. The next area of operation that we discussed it in the morning, this is the electronic jihad strategy. We establish capabilities via the internet platform. We carried out our operation via the internet. These will be the electronic jihadists. These will be the electronic soldiers of the jihad. So this is another strategy that we need to bear in our mind when it comes to this organization. The main goal, destruction. At the end of the day, what they want to achieve is destruction of the Western communities. And then they have the last component of their strategy, the battles for the heart and the mind. This is the implementation of the vision of these organizations during the year. Religious justification, what we can say that there is evolution within the jihadi groups. The religious justification started with religious committee and ended with religious scholars. Every leadership will have religious committee and religious scholars that give him a religious justification for ideology or for the new trends. So they need it for their strategic axis. The next is defining strategic concept. This is the major effort versus secondary effort. They could not carry out an attack all over. You need to decide far enemy, near enemy. You need to decide priority. The first priority now is the Arab state, then is Israel, and then is another one. Meaning the strategic concept, you need to decide every time what will be your primary goal and what will be your secondary goal. And this is a huge debate within the jihadi group until today. Flexibility, they need to be flexible, and you can see it within the strategic axis. Flexibility in defining efforts in the face of changing enemy actions, in the eyes of the jihadists also. Here is a pyramid that was the 7 phases strategy. This is the pyramid of 7 phases strategy that they said that at the end of the day, it will be the victory of Islam all over the world. This strategy, 7 phases strategy, was published by Al-Qaeda. But ISIS used it for his purposes. ISIS used it for his purposes, and ISIS promoted within this concept that the Islamic Caliphate was developed during 2013, during 2016. Meaning we have the ability to use something within the global strategy of Al-Qaeda by ISIS and for their purposes. The second component that I want to discuss here regarding the strategy, this is the Zawahiri strategy. The last publication of Zawahiri strategy in September 2013, the last major strategy that was published by Zawahiri, was that he said that we need to carry out our activity on the level of 2 plans. One is the military plan, focusing on United States and Israel, meaning the far enemy. And the secondary plan is to focus on the allies, the Muslim countries, the near enemy. Meaning from the 2013, what Zawahiri tried to promote to his audience all over the world, we have this priority, far enemy first, near enemy after, okay? And the Dawah activity was controlled to the line of the jihad, to the line of these 2 major concepts. But if you open the Al-Qaeda digital magazine in 2015, and you try to, this is the Al-Qaeda magazine called Resurgence, and you try to take out from the messages that they deliver through the magazine, I don't know if you know, the magazine of Al-Qaeda, the digital magazine, became the most important component to deliver message to the people. Because as you know, within the jihadi forums, the forums are closed, are not targeting wide audience. Your ability to target wide audience is only through this digital magazine. So what Al-Qaeda tells the entire targeted audience, we are global and international reach. We are fighting against America. We don't have a written Aqidah, meaning written doctrine. Everybody can join Al-Qaeda and we can accept it. It should be, at the end of the day, Salafis. A recognition of the importance of the public relation for the Mujahideen, meaning the winning the heart and the mind of the people. They understand that they need the people. And close ties with the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. This is the concept that Al-Qaeda 2015 want to promote. This is the main idea behind their strategy, so you can see that there is a link between all the strategy publications of this organization. And if you have another component of the Al-Qaeda strategy within the same, within the first digital magazine that they published in fall 2014, what they called their audience to target maritime entities. And I think it was one of the first time that we saw in the middle of Al-Qaeda publication that they promoted targeted maritime entities, because they understood that this is one of the weak points of the entire global economy, and they want to carry out this kind of operation. The second component that I want to describe is regarding that was taken from Al-Qaeda as central strategy, also summer 2015. It was published in 2013, a document that published in 2013 but posted in 2015, in August 2015, based in Arabic in one of the jihadi forums. Behind this publication was Saif al-Adel and Muhammad Salah ad-Din. The name of the publication was Military and Political Research, the Jihad and the Wind of Change, the Revolution and the Strategy. Major topics that you can take from this publication was the importance of recruitment public support. You see that Al-Qaeda changed a little bit its mindset from only jihad to recruit public support, mobilizing society to join jihad and how to do it, exploiting the Arab Spring Revolution, but it's not ended here. The strategy based on research of some case study that was carried out by these guys, Saif al-Adel and others. One of them is the collapse of Mubarak. The second is the fall of Morsi. And what they think, they try to promote some major topics within this kind of operation. One, establishment of vanguard unit. It's not new. We knew it from Said Qutb time, but they continue the concept of establishing vanguard unit. Effort to recruit support of army personnel in different parts around the world. It's also a Muslim Brotherhood a strategy. Using dawah and jihad, dismantling the old institution, establishing new political system and administration. Meaning there is a coherence, there is something link, a line that you can see within Al-Qaeda, a rank of a strategy. Al-Qaeda policy and strategy translated by the branches to educational systems that were delivered by experts in a training camps and in the Jihadi military academy. And I want to share with you only one example. This is the guy from Yemen. This is from the military academy of the Jihad in Yemen. He is not with us anymore. El-Anasi, he was killed. But you can find out, based on this publication of these groups, that Al-Qaeda Jihadi Military Academy has a curriculum and lectures, a lot of lectures and a huge curriculum. Partly was posted on the internet in 2014. There are some clips that you see these on the ground. The major trainer and expert was Nasser bin Ali al-Anasi. He, as I mentioned before, he's not with us anymore. Program contained 60 chapters, not one, not two, 60 chapters, 3 levels of lectures for beginners, for advanced students, and for experts. Just trying to understand, we are describing the way that the enemy is thinking and how the enemy has posted his operations on the ground. Here it is. When it comes to the Jihadi Military Academy by ACAP, there are 3 levels of discussion, and the picture was taken from the eclipse. Strategic level, meaning how to do grand strategy, direct and indirect strategy, technology, the importance of maneuvers. We are describing Yemen in Yemenite jihadi groups in Yemen, the importance of maneuvers, and the concept of wars. Operational level, how to carry out offense, defense, command and control, and planning cycle. In the tactical level, what they try to promote, concept of anti-guerrilla war, combat training, guerrilla tactics, defense and offense tactics. You see that we are dealing with an enemy that has strategy, operational level, and tactic level, and how to carry out a strategy and how to implement a strategy on the ground. From summer 2015 resurgence, this is the Al-Qaeda digital magazine. It said very clearly the guerrilla force is in its capacity as a vanguard of revolutionary change, make the process that enabled them to recruit the masses to support the organization itself. On the other side, ISIS strategy. Also, ISIS strategy was very clear. Hijrah and jihad. Simple and clear for everything. He didn't want to take the strategy and to make it very complicated. What we want you is to make hijrah, immigration, to the theaters of jihad and jihad. And if you want us to give you another robust, more robust strategy, this is the phases of this strategy. Immigration, this is hijrah. Jama'ah, congregation. Stabilize the Dawut, this is the stabilization. And then consolidation and building the caliphate. This is the phases that ISIS did on the ground in Syria and in Iraq, and this is the phases that he tried to deliver, the strategy that he tried to deliver to his audience. So within the Islamic ISIS, within the ISIS strategy, we have some components that we need to understand. Building stronghold in the occupied territories, control critical infrastructures, protect the caliphate from Iran. It's a very bitter enemy of them because they're Shiite. So we need, from the early days of the caliphate, to protect the caliphate against Iran, and then to act against the Syrian regime and the other component. How they establish it in the modus operandi. They establish it in the modus operandi by some different level, 4 major different levels. Strategic attack model, this was Al-Qaeda central use in 9/11 attack, meaning the central command of the organization carried out an attack. It take time, it take around 2 years, using it by a project manager, and this kind of operation is operating on the ground. Medium level of operation, jihadi front, used by ISIS, this used by AQAP and used by Al-Shabaab, meaning we are not describing a small cell or a small group, we are describing battalions, we are describing a lot of people that are taking part in one attack, we are describing a strategic attack that was carried out by jihadists. Okay? It's totally different when the concept of the jihadists that operating in the near enemy area, or the jihadists that we found during the 60s and the 70s. These are brigades and battalions that were operated on the ground. Strategic attack that was carried out by jihadi fronts, meaning by Al-Qaeda in Yemen, by other groups, and individual attack that was carried out by a small group. I just want to describe. Nobody tell me to stop. I need to stop. Somebody from the panel said that I need to stop. They are afraid to say it. Okay. Okay. I will stop within 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah. That's more difficult than to stop me on this travel. You know, it's really more difficult than to stop me. Okay, the medium ISIS concept, ISIS medium intensity jihadi campaign. When it comes to ISIS, you can find out there is theaters of central command. We have united group. This is with the operational room and battalions. We have foreign fighters that they have their operational room and battalions, and we have local groups. Because ISIS from time to time is a merge between some groups that are operating in different areas. All of them are under the concept of wilayat or sectors that we find. And we have the media arm. So they carried out a medium intensity jihadi operation and Dawah campaign. This is the area of their operation. They want to have a territory. They want to establish a Sharia law. They want to establish the caliphate. That's what they are doing. If I take the story of ISIS and put it in the phases of the attack that we face until today, phase number 1 of ISIS operational campaign, strategic offensive between June and August 2014. Phase number 2, end of offensive campaign between August to September 2014. Phase number 3, I call it the strategic defense, between November 2014 until March 2015. During this time, they established international network, they established alliances, and they enhanced their control on the civil society. Phase number 4, this was the spring campaign that started in March but stopped. And what we have today, strategic defense. Meaning everybody defends his line, small wars, small battles, and that's it. I will stop with this last slide, but I want to discuss this slide because I want you to understand how ISIS used the concept of delivering messages to his audience. This slide shows the defensive message of ISIS. ISIS promoted within his publication the story of the Murabitun, the importance of doing of Operation of Murabitun. Operation of Murabitun saying we need to defend our line, we need to defend our border, and this is important like the jihad. So when you open the information, the digital magazines of ISIS, you will see a lot of discussion from Murabitun. I stop here, and if we have time afterward, I will a question at the end. No. Question at the end. I am the boss of this session. Okay. Next, my friend William, your time. Thank you. Don't get mad on me. בסדר. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is William Braniff. I'm the Executive Director of the STAR Consortium, and I'm going to take yet another shot at the topic of the competition between Al-Qaeda and its associated movement, and what I'd like to call the Islamic State and its associated movement. In August in 2014, I was asked to brief a group within the United States intelligence community about this surprise move from Syria into Iraq of this group, the Islamic State. And so I thought about that briefing, and then afterwards wrote down a very short conceptual article that I published in our START newsletter in August of 2014 called A Tale of Two Caliphates. And what I'd like to do is now revisit that paper over a year later and see how some of those conceptual hypotheses are holding up. Now, I want to explain why I use the acronym the Islamic State and its associated movement. A lot of what we do at START is try to do good research, high-quality research, but then translate that to the policy and practitioner community. And I use this acronym because in the United States, policymakers are laser-focused on Iraq and Syria, and I think that may cause them to miss the boat on some of the more important security issues emanating from the Islamic State. As tragic as Iraq and Syria are, to get ahead of this organization, we have to take the blinders off from just that geographic area. For example, policymakers are only focused in the United States on foreign fighters leaving the United States, going to Iraq and Syria, and coming home. And of course, that's a concern. But the truth is, if we think about the history of Al-Qaeda and its associated movement, how Al-Qaeda has proliferated, the flow of foreign fighters typically goes into a conflict zone, and from that conflict zone to the next conflict zone, where veterans from the first conflict zone carry with them the tactics, the operations, and the strategy of Al-Qaeda's global jihad. And once they get there, they reorient the nature of the violence in that new conflict zone. And that's how Al-Qaeda has proliferated, right? It's veterans carrying this like a vector in infecting a new conflict zone. And ISIL is likely to follow this same trajectory. And by calling ISIS the Islamic State and its associated movement, I'm hoping that we can learn from the case study of Al-Qaeda and its proliferation. So the starting line for this competition. In 2012, it was the worst year of terrorism on record, dating back to 1970, according to our global terrorism database. Then 2013 came, and that was the most lethal and active year of terrorism, dating back to 1970. And then 2014 came, and it blew 2013 away in terms of lethality and numbers of terrorist attacks around the world. 16,800 terrorist attacks killed 43,500 people. There were 41,000 injuries. 11,800 people were taken hostage. That's 4 times the average, the yearly average between 1970 and 2013. There were 28 mass casualty attacks, each of which caused over 100 fatalities. The average prior to 2014 was 3.7 mass casualty attacks, compared to 28. So I'm not talking about an abstract competition at this, who's going to have primacy in the global jihadist movement, who's the poster child. I'm saying on the ground, organizationally, the provinces of the Islamic State and the affiliates and associated groups of al-Qaeda are competing for the next recruit, the next donor dollar, and for the local constituency. And that violent competition, of course, we call outbidding. That's something we all know from terrorism theory. More importantly, Victor Assal and Karl Rettemeyer, using an organizational-level data set, a longitudinal data set that tracks organizations over time, has demonstrated that the single greatest predictor of increasing group lethality over time is competition between terrorist groups, right? So that outbidding theory appears to be borne out by their organizational-level data. And now let's think about this starting point. So if theory and some data from the bad data set suggests that the starting point for this, that competition is likely to increase lethality, and the starting point for this competition is the most lethal and active terrorist organizations in modern history. Because we know that 6 or 7, depending on the year, of the most lethal and active groups in 2012, 2013, and 2014 were either members of al-Qaeda and its associated movement or the Islamic State and its associated movement. So 2 constellations of exceptionally, historically lethal groups are going to be competing if theory tells us anything. It's frightening. So what does some of the data suggest? Here I picked the global jihadist groups within the top 20 most active groups in 2014. And I compare the total attacks 2014, I show the total attacks by group in 2014, the total fatalities, and then I made one mistake on here. That last column should say % change in total fatalities, not total attacks. So it's attacks and then fatalities.
Nobody.
Well, it doesn't make much sense otherwise. That's okay. We all make mistakes. Now, these are conservative numbers because these are attacks for which we can assign attribution to a specific group. And we have a pretty high threshold for that. So there's no assumptions here. We know that these groups were attributed responsibility for these attacks. They're conservative figures as a result because a lot of attacks go unclaimed and unattributed. So if you look at the level of violence in the countries affected, the numbers are much, much higher. And it's very possible that some of these groups were responsible for some of those attacks as well. But look at the % increases from 2013 to 2014. Now, I cannot say that this is causation, right? The data does not say that because of group competition, that is the single cause for increasing frequency and lethality of attacks. That's not what it's not what I can prove. But these are pretty alarming, right? So the hypotheses that I wanted to revisit, right, I think from this article from August 2014, I think they hold up. And the concerns are as follows, right, that weak nations straining under sectarian pressure will not have either the will or the capacity to marginalize violent Sunni extremist groups, right? Either Sunni nations will be too busy fighting against Shia formations, or they'll see groups like al-Qaeda and its associated movement as useful instruments in fighting against destabilizing revolutionary groups like ISIL or Shia formations. And further, that ISIL will do what it does best, which is use existing sectarian or internecine tensions to mobilize resources, right? The Islamic State has a destabilization strategy, as we've just heard. They play on local tensions and try to ramp up violence by antagonizing each of these different religious, ethnic communities, etc. And the thing about ISIL's mobilization strategy, which is so dangerous, is that there are no sidelines in ISIL's war. You can't sit out ISIL's war if it's in your neighborhood. When al-Qaeda establishes a shop in your neighborhood and tells you to go impale yourself on the U.S. embassy or go attack the U.S. Business or that Western business or those tourists, you can sit out that war. Right? That cosmic abstract fight may have nothing to do with your day-to-day existence. It may have nothing to do with your set of grievances or your concerns. ISIL comes into your town and they murder your next-door neighbor's family because of their identity. You have very little choice but to mobilize in response. There is no sideline in that fight. You can't sit it out. And so for ISIL, destabilization generates mobilization on both sides, not just in there for them, right, but on all sides. And that creates a broader sort of destabilizing set of resources pouring into an environment. And if you believe you're the baddest actor on the block, the most willing to kill, the most willing to take, the more resources pour into the fight, it's like oxygen or gasoline on a fire, the better. Right? And we've seen resources going in to support ISIL's enemies wind up in ISIL's hands in Iraq and Syria. Right? We've seen that play out. So here are some worst case outcomes if these hypotheses continue to bear out. And these are not one consistent picture. These are different potential futures. And the first, I think, is really important. The reason I use the Islamic State and its associated movement is to try to highlight the fact that what we're talking about is a group that is playing on wider sectarian tensions that exist in the post-Arab Spring world. In the post-Arab Spring world, you've got Shia, or Iranian-backed Shia formations in Damascus, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq. So the contours of a wider regional sectarian civil war are maybe starting to play out. And then you've got an antagonistic group like ISIL exacerbating that situation, actively trying to stir up greater sectarian tension. So the problem with ISIL isn't ISIL. I mean, the worst case situation is that ISIL sparks a wider sectarian conflict that is a force of nature much, much bigger and greater than ISIL. And that's what U.S. policy should, and I think international policy should be geared towards. You don't gear your policy towards the symptom, right, or the factor that's making that's exacerbating that issue. You try to prevent that worst case outcome from coming, and then hopefully treat ISIL as a symptom of that broader problem. The United States government is not thinking about mitigating sectarianism. It's thinking about focusing on the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and that's too narrow. A second potential outcome, which we've heard, is that Al-Qaeda and its associated movement will be perceived as more mainstream and legitimate. And this is something that has been covered in the conference over the last few days. Social movement theory calls it the radical fringe effect, the idea that when a more extreme actor pops up on the extreme of a political spectrum, everybody else looks more legitimate by default. And Al-Qaeda will start to look like a useful instrument fighting against these more extreme organizations like ISIL, or, again, your sectarian enemy like the Shia. The third is that the Sinai province carves out enough safe haven to wage a sustained campaign against Israel or Egypt. Now, I want to talk about this for a second. According to the Global Terrorism Database at START, there were 346 incidents of terrorism in Egypt in 2014, 69 of which were either claimed or attributed to Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis or the Sinai province. In the first 3 months of 2015, according to preliminary data, there have already been 248 incidents of terrorism in Egypt, and 27 have been attributed or claimed by the Sinai province of the Islamic State. So 2015 in Egypt and in the Sinai is looking much worse than 2014, which was already pretty bad. And 52% of the attacks attributed to the Sinai province of the Islamic State targeted Egyptian military and police. Why does a terrorist organization target military and police? To carve out safe haven, right? To create some room to maneuver. Why do you create a safe haven? So that you can conduct a sustained campaign of violence over time. That campaign of violence is going to be oriented in one of two directions: Cairo or Israel. Think about what this means, right? Hamas and Hezbollah gain tremendous legitimacy for their resistance ideology and that resistance narrative. Imagine a province of the Islamic State, a caliphate, which has the legitimacy, according to its own self-perception, to declare offensive jihad. That's a one-up on Hamas, on Hezbollah, on Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda talks about Jerusalem. All of the Al-Qaeda franchises in their propaganda mention Jerusalem. It's a token clarion call for mobilization. Imagine the Islamic State actually doing it. I'm not saying that they're going to capture Jerusalem, but launching a sustained campaign of violence against Israel, something Al-Qaeda has never been able to muster. Right? If you're the Islamic State and you start to take losses in Iraq and Syria on the ground, you start to lose cities or lose terrain. one of the greatest sort of sleight of hand maneuvers you could do is capture the world's attention from the Sinai. Similarly, we have a large number of disenfranchised Islamists in Egypt who have just seen their control over the government taken away in a coup. So now, where are these disenfranchised Islamists going? Who are they going to line up with? Should the Islamic State either start to launch attacks against Cairo successfully in a campaign of violence, or bait Israel into a cross-border response to provocation? Right? I think it's a very dangerous scenario. And of course, this is in the future. I don't mean to sort of be fear-mongering, but what I'm suggesting is policy and practice now needs to be geared towards containing these worst-case scenarios. But if we only think about Iraq and Syria, we won't get ahead of these kinds of concerns. Finally, maybe the last reason that the Islamic State would do something like this is their fascination with internecine violence as a tool for mobilization. They talk about al-Malahem, right, bringing on this apocalyptic battle between the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. It's a big part of Dabiq magazine. It's an important part of their ideology. Jean-Pierre Filiu really thinks that it's a very good recruiting tool, right? Not necessarily because these groups fundamentally believe in this, although certainly individuals do. But what a great, actually conducting an attack against the Jewish state would be quite an important way to advance that kind of recruitment narrative. And then finally, something I don't think it's been brought up in the conference yet, we have to remember what al-Qaeda's strategy is, their ultimate strategy, right? Why has al-Qaeda declared jihad against the far enemy, the United States? It's part of an attrition strategy, right? In al-Qaeda, it makes no secret about the fact that it is waging a war of attrition against the West. They're trying to attrit our military, political, and economic will to remain engaged in the Muslim world. To do that, what al-Qaeda has done historically is insert itself into other people's violent conflicts and reorient the nature of that violent conflict so that existing militant groups start to target Western targets. And what this does is it creates little brush fires all over the world. All of a sudden, the United States has to care about Somalia, the Indian subcontinent, North Africa, West Africa, right? All these little fires around the world. And so they've conflict hopped and reoriented the nature of violence in those places, all to attrit the United States' will to remain engaged in the Muslim world. Once we voluntarily pull out, once the American citizen tells his or her congressperson, stop investing in the Muslim world, it's too violent, it's too backwards, we can't fix it, pull out, let's take our ball, go home, then local and regional jihadist groups can overthrow their governments. So it's a rational attrition strategy to sever the ties between the West and the Muslim world. Does it matter if ISIL is competing with al-Qaeda, if they're advancing al-Qaeda's attrition strategy? If this competition plays out, in all the places where al-Qaeda has a franchise and ISIL has a province, and more violence takes place, that advances al-Qaeda's strategy. Even if it's not done at the behest of al-Qaeda, the end result will likely be the same: the attrition of the West's willingness to remain engaged in these places. Now, al-Qaeda may not be happy about that outcome if they don't get credit for it, but that's the goal. And ISIL helps to advance that goal. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, William. Okay. And now, please, Rohan.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by referring to the father of the global jihad. He was Abdullah Azam. He was born about 30 to 40 kilometers from here in West Bank. He came from a very small village called Silat el-Harthia. I think the Israeli colleagues who are here are aware of this. Abdullah Azam, of course, went to study in Egypt, subsequently taught in Saudi Arabia, and in many ways he created the first jihad movement that has continuity to the present. And that is a group that mobilized those Muslim youth that came to Pakistan to fight in the anti-Soviet multinational Afghan Jihad that began in 1979 December. The group was known as Maktab al-Khidamat. It was Maktab al-Khidamat that evolved into Al-Qaeda. And I want to share a little bit with you about the origins of Al-Qaeda, having shared with you the origins of Abdul Azam. Al-Qaeda as a concept, as an idea, didn't come from bin Laden. It came from Abdul Azam. In fact, he wrote in the famous Arab journal called Al-Jihad, in a particular issue that was produced in 1988, he wrote an article about the idea of a pioneering vanguard. So Azam's mind, Abdul Azam's mind, and later his student and protege, bin Laden, followed the concept of the pioneering vanguard. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, that Al-Qaeda attacked America's most iconic landmarks. The most economic landmark, the World Trade Center, was reduced to rubble and dust. The second target, the Pentagon, symbol of America's military power. And the last plane that crashed in Pennsylvania was targeting Congress, America's political landmark. So, in many ways, what Al-Qaeda wanted to do was to mobilize the Muslim groups in Asia, Africa, Middle East, and also the Muslim masses to start a fight against the US, their allies, and their friends. That particular journal of Al-Jihad that described the concept of Al-Qaeda, after 9/11, the Americans looked for it. The CIA looked for it. They could never find it because they were not meticulous in collecting information pertaining to those jihad groups. But there was a security service in the world, just one service that had collected it. And that is the Shin Bet, the Shabak. And in fact, the man who was then the head of research of Shin Bet, Dr. Rohan Pass, he had a copy of it. I believe that that particular magazine was mailed to Azam's village, and it may have been intercepted by the Israeli service.
They wouldn't do so.
But what is interesting about this particular journal is that Rohan Pass wrote a piece about the formation of Al-Qaeda. And at that time, when he wrote that piece, none of the Western services knew that was the origin of Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda was created as the vanguard to galvanize and to mobilize the Muslim masses. To some extent, Al-Qaeda succeeded because Al-Qaeda brought to Afghanistan groups from Asia, Africa, Middle East. More than 30 different groups. It brought the Abu Sayyaf group, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement from Far East, brought Jama Islamiyah from Southeast Asia, the Kumpulan Militan Malaysia, also from Southeast Asia, from Central Asia, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and a number of groups from South Asia, notably the groups from Pakistan, and trained them. But Al-Qaeda also built those partnerships with the groups in North Africa, in the Levant, and in the Arabian Peninsula. Of course, the groups from Africa formed quite a large contingent. It included the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Islamic Group of Egypt, the Moroccan Islamic Combatant Group, the Tunisian Islamic Combatant Group, the Libyan Islamic Fighters Group. So a number of groups. And it is those groups that eventually formed the initial wave of the global jihad movement. What we have seen is that Al-Qaeda was able to provide 4 very important ingredients to bring these groups together. One was a common ideology. You must fight in your local theaters against those corrupt governments, the false Muslim rulers. I'm just quoting Al-Qaeda propaganda. And said, but you must also attack the US, the distant enemy, and their allies and their friends in Europe and elsewhere. So Al-Qaeda in many ways worked on that ideology that existed of jihad, that was used to fight the Soviets, and transformed it in a way where it had great appeal and resonance. Certainly not to the extent of IS. IS is the son of Al-Qaeda, but it's a son that went against the father. Because if you look at IS, the first group that was formed was with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, with Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, his mentor, traveling from Jordan to Pakistan. They created a group called Jund al-Sham, and they created their own training camp called the Al-Mata training camp in Herat, close to Iran. And of course, after 2001, September, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi moved to Kandahar, where his friend Abu Hafs, also known as Muhammad Atif, the military commander of Al-Qaeda, was killed in the US drone strike in November of 2001. So we saw that after that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi moved from Afghanistan to Iran, where he was briefly detained. And then he moved to the north of Iraq, where he established a presence. And in many ways, Jund al-Sham is the genesis or the predecessor of modern IS. It went through four stages. Jund al-Sham became Tawhid wal-Jihad. Tawhid wal-Jihad became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq became the Mujahideen Shura Council, and the Mujahideen Shura Council became the Islamic State of Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq became Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. And Islamic State of Iraq and Sham became the Islamic State. So in many ways, that is the evolution of a group that was an associate group of Al-Qaeda. With the formation of IS, with the declaration of a caliphate, the 29th of 2014, great appeal. We saw a number of Muslim terrorist and extremist groups and guerrilla groups pledging allegiance to IS. IS did not accept even 10% of those groups that had expressed support to IS as their partners. Very selective, very much like Al-Qaeda. But again, those groups continue to advance a common goal in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Today, what we are seeing is, as my colleague mentioned, two constellations of groups fighting each other. There is a theory among Western scholars about this fight, but I want to share my own view about this fight. It is a fight not between two organizations. It is a fight between two leaders. Even if you look at the IS literature, you will see that the IS leaders, IS writers, IS ideologues, they still respect Osama bin Laden. So in many ways, the fight is not an organizational fight. It's not an ideological fight, but it is a dispute between the two leaders. Our own assessment, the assessment of the Specialist Center in Singapore, is that if either of these two leaders are killed, whether it is Ayman al-Zawahiri, whether it is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, certainly these two groups will come together. It's a leadership dispute. And if that happens, certainly the threat will increase many more times than the current threat. Let me make two concluding remarks. IS performance in the last 1 year has in many ways shocked many countries in the world. But IS can also be defeated. But in the last 1 year, despite all the military effort, the diplomatic effort, the political effort, the economic effort, and the informational effort, IS has continued to grow. IS has continued to fight back, and IS has continued to expand ideologically and operationally. It is not because governments have lacked the capabilities. It is that the governments have lacked the will to fight. It's not only the governments of the West because of public pressures, but the governments in the Arab world. So in many ways, the country that is fighting IS most effectively, it's something that my friends in Israel don't want to hear. They are the Shia militia, the Hezbollah, and the Iranian-funded groups. And certainly, the more you fight, the better you become. The greater the capabilities you will develop. So certainly the Shia groups, the Hezbollah, will develop greater strengths and greater capabilities in the coming years. So in many ways, the threat to Israel will grow. It is inevitable. And I also want to share with you that unless there is a greater cooperation and collaboration, maybe forged by those Western nations that are now in retreat from the major conflict zones of the world, in Afghanistan and Iraq, the threat will grow. Did the West, did our American friends who have the finest armies, 20 years more advanced than even the European armies, did they lose in Afghanistan? Yes, they have. If you can't win a fight, that means you have lost the fight. So what is important is for there to be a greater resolve on the part of the West and the Arab world in how to tackle IS. IS threat is not only in the core area of Iraq and Syria. Of course, this is the main preoccupation of the Middle Eastern countries and of Israel. But IS is spreading very rapidly, globally, ideologically. In fact, I would often say IS ideology is sprinting. Governments and their partners who are engaged in counter-ideological work, they are just crawling. So every month, every year, we are seeing several hundreds of Asian, Middle Eastern and African youth, European youth, traveling to IS-controlled territory. Because the border between Iraq and Turkey, the Turkish border itself is a very porous border. Even if Turkey is determined to stop the movement of these people, it will be very difficult. There will be other lines created for IS to grow. And that means IS will remain a very significant entity. IS strength is not only Iraq and Syria. IS provinces in Africa, IS provinces in the Caucasus, in Asia are growing. It's a question of time IS will conduct more operations, more effective operations from those provinces. So in terms of scale of threat, since the formation of Maktab al-Khidamat, since the formation of Al-Qaeda in the early phases, the scale of threat that the global jihad movement is presenting today is huge. Certainly, IS has supplanted the Al-Qaeda role and also replaced Al-Qaeda as the center of the global jihad movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rohan. And now we want to hear some discussion from Jacob. Please, Jacob, take your place.
Thank you very much. Today, I will present to the audience a case study. We've been hearing a lot about the global threat of the Islamic State and its expansion, so we'll take a deep dive into the case of how Boko Haram pledged to the Islamic State. And my hope is that this case study can provide a template of how other groups may also pledge to the Islamic State and join from other parts of the world. What are the steps that groups take? What are the indicators of possible mergers? And what are the outcomes of such mergers? As you know, as Dr. Rohan just said, groups like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, they've already pledged to the Islamic State. Groups in Indonesia, such as Mujahideen Indonesia Timur, based in Sulawesi, they've showed their pledge, but Islamic State has not yet accepted. And groups like Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, they've also pledged to the Islamic State. Islamic State has yet to accept that. So we can discuss these dynamics in comparative perspective, again focusing on Boko Haram. Let me also tell you why I call the title Al-Qaeda in Disguise, Islamic State Unmasked. And one reason for this is that for years, since the insurgency of Boko Haram began around 2010, Al-Qaeda had very strong influence on Boko Haram, but it was very hard to see, and it was largely disguised. For one, Boko Haram, its real name that it uses is Jama'atu Ahli Sunni li Dawati wal Jihad, which I'll call JAS for the sake of this presentation. It doesn't include the word Al-Qaeda in it. The Al-Qaeda faction that entered Nigeria was originally called Al-Qaeda in the lands beyond the Sahel, but changed its name to Ansar al-Muslimin fi Bilad al-Sudan, or the supporters of Muslims in the land of blacks. And that was also taking the Al-Qaeda out of the name. And part of this was a strategic effect to not let the world know that Al-Qaeda is involved in Nigeria. And David Gardenstein Ross talked yesterday about how bin Laden had considered changing the name of Al-Qaeda. And I think one of the ways that this was implemented was actually in Nigeria, because they didn't want the world to know that Al-Qaeda was involved. Second reason why it was hard to see the Al-Qaeda influence in Nigeria is that it was largely an institutional impact. In other words, most members of Boko Haram were not necessarily Al-Qaeda. It was a very small number, but those members of Al-Qaeda who merged with Boko Haram had a very significant impact on the tactics, techniques, and procedures of Boko Haram. And when you look at that, which I'll discuss today, you could begin to see more how those small minority of Al-Qaeda militants affected the overall movement as an institution. And third, Boko Haram was not and has never been an Al-Qaeda affiliate in terms of formally recognized, so it wasn't out there for everyone to see, obviously. There were also some policy reasons why in different capitals people didn't want to look too closely at the Al-Qaeda relationship with Boko Haram, because there was concern that that would lead to an internationalization of the response to Boko Haram, and that would only exacerbate the insurgency. However, from an analytical perspective, we need to do our most accurate analysis. But even if Boko Haram is a transnational jihadist group, it does not necessarily mean that there needs to be a transnational response. That is for policymakers to debate. And I call the group Islamic State Unmasked because now it's very clear that in March 2015, Boko Haram pledged to the Islamic State, and shortly after, not only the Islamic State Corps, but 10 Islamic State provinces accepted the pledge. So Boko Haram is now called Walaya West Africa, or the West Africa province of the Islamic State. So let me continue on. A brief background on Boko Haram. It is 80 to 90% of the attacks occur in Borno State in northeastern Nigeria. Borno State is the plurality, and historically, Borno State is home to the ethnic Kanuri group. One could likely make a decent comparison of the Kanuris to the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, to the current state of the Sunni Arabs in the Iraq-Syria border region, in the sense that they are not well empowered economically, politically, or socially within Nigeria. Moreover, the traditional empire of the Kanuri people is now divided between Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. So there is a sense of loss of a great, what was an empire or caliphate, that is now divided, and now the Kanuris are left weak in all four of those countries. So beyond the Islamic rhetoric of Boko Haram, there is an ethnic kinship tie that likely has parallels elsewhere. Now, when Boko Haram started as a preaching group from around 2002 to 2010, it was engaged in dawah. And as I said, Boko Haram's real name is Jama'atu Ahli Sunni li Dawah wal Jihad, preaching, and jihad. And for 8 years, it was simply preaching and attracting members. It strayed from mainstream Salafist groups in 2 ways. One, there was a ban on any form of Western education, English language, science, and so forth. And second, they declared anyone who worked with the Nigerian government as an apostate, because the Nigerian government was secular and the country is a federal democracy. So because of that, the mainstream Salafist groups, which even themselves have a lot of extremists that supported Osama bin Laden, for example, pushed Boko Haram out of their equation. And due to the intransigent ideology of Boko Haram, a clash was inevitable with the state. And they occurred sporadically in the mid-2000s. The big one occurred in 2009, where the Nigerian security forces tried to eradicate Boko Haram, killed 1,000 members, suffered about 24 losses from the security forces, and after that Boko Haram moved from dawah, or preaching, to jihad. However, what's often overlooked is that in the mid-2000s, the then leader of Boko Haram, I believe, was expecting a clash to take place, knowing that they would shift to jihad mode. And there were Nigerians who were training very deeply with AQIM, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, throughout the mid-2000s. Some Nigerian people in the Boko Haram network also went to Pakistan and were involved in the broader networks of the assassination of Benazir Bhutto or the attack on the Sri Lankan cricket team in Islamabad in 2010. So when the Nigerians who had trained with AQIM returned to Nigeria around 2011, their impact was immediately felt. And the map on the screen with a blue and a red circle shows 2 different theaters of operation in Nigeria. The blue circle is where the more indigenous Boko Haram movement continued to carry out attacks after the major clashes with the security forces in 2009. There were many attacks, but they were not particularly sophisticated. However, the red circle shows largely where the Boko Haram members who had trained with AQIM and returned to Nigeria operated. A much larger space, many fewer attacks, but much more sophisticated attacks, very much in the mold of AQIM, including mostly kidnappings and ambushes on Nigerian troops, particularly those who were going to deploy to Mali. And the ideology of the claims of these attacks largely had to do with issues like Mali and Afghanistan, which at the time were not major parts of the narrative of the more indigenous Boko Haram movement in the Northeast. Another way that you could see the impact of the Sahelian-trained Boko Haram members on the Nigerian theater was the way that they even presented themselves. So in the kidnapping of the British and the Italian engineer in northwestern Sokoto state in 2011, they even wore Sahelian type of clothing in their hostage video, which is not typical for Nigerian militants who usually wear green American-style military fatigues. And even the logo of the Nigerians who returned to Nigeria after training with AQIM reflects their Sahelian origins. So you see on the top the Algerian national emblem with the setting sun symbolizing the Maghreb region. In the middle, you see the emblem of the GSPC, which is the Salafist group for preaching and combat, which was the predecessor of AQIM, which hosted many Nigerians. And on the very bottom, you see the logo of Ansaru. Ansaru is the group of Nigerians who trained with AQIM and came back to Nigeria to carry out their attacks around 2011 in a somewhat separate theater from the more indigenous Boko Haram movement. Again, fewer attacks in the northwest, more sophisticated, more attacks in the northeast in the blue circle, less sophisticated. They did not integrate very well at first due to issues that any organization can face over rivalry over money, somewhat different ideology. The leader of Boko Haram in the northeast had a takfirist ideology like al-Zarqawi in Iraq. The ones in the northwest had a much more al-Zawahiri methodological ideology in the northwest. So there was 2 different theaters at that point. A key point in the analysis, and that is reflected as we look at how Boko Haram became ISIS, is to understand how this Al-Qaeda-like movement called Ansaru in the northwest merged with Boko Haram in the northeast and ended up driving the lead towards the pledge to the Islamic State. But the way that we can largely determine this merger is one, because there were some mutual claims. For example, a kidnapping was claimed jointly between Ansaru and Boko Haram. But otherwise, we can look at tactics, techniques, and procedures and how they shifted from the northwest and then began showing up in the northeast. So the kidnappings, there were 11 of them in 2011 to 2013 in the northwest. At that time, there were 0 in the Northeast. All those kidnappings were of foreigners, and all of them were killed, Europeans. However, starting in 2013, 2014, the network in the Northwest disappeared. And this is that AQIM network. It disappeared because of, in particular, UK and Nigerian joint counterterrorism operations. 2, the leader of the Northeastern insurgency, Shekau, started killing these cells in the Northwest. In the very same way we see ISIS and Al-Qaeda killing each other in Iraq because he didn't like rivalry. And 3rd, after the Mali intervention in 2013, these Nigerians who trained with AQIM no longer had their support base with their patrons, and they needed to find a new place to go, and that's why they joined in the Northeast. So you saw kidnappings emerge in northeastern Nigeria's Borno states. Dozens of mid-level officials were kidnapped and ransomed for about $10,000 to $30,000. And what's way overlooked in global terrorism discourse, and hope it's in your data set, is that there was 22 kidnappings of foreigners in Cameroon between 2013 and 2015, very much an AQIM style, and all of them were sold, ransomed for millions of dollars in the exchange of prisoners. So you see the shift of tactics from Nigeria to the Cameroon-Borno border region. Also, IEDs were used much more strategically in 2013, 2014, after this AQIM Boko Haram merger. Desert warfare tactics all of a sudden began to be imported into northeastern Nigeria. And in particular, those are the tactics that you would have seen in Mali, where convoys of 4x4s go with mountain weapons and raid military barracks. That type of attack set the stage for Boko Haram's subsequent occupation of territory around 2014, 2015 in the lead up to the Islamic State pledge. And also what we began seeing in 2013, 2014 after the merger from the more sophisticated AQIM-trained Nigerians and the more indigenous group was video recorded attacks. Not only carrying out an attack, but video recording it, adding a nasheed, and showing it to the world via YouTube or whatnot. And a key turning point was the Chibok kidnapping, which everyone is probably familiar with, where 250 girls were taken from their school. At least 3 aspects of this attack highlight the coordination between these AQIM-trained Nigerians and the more indigenous Boko Haram movement. 1, it's a cross-border operation. It's widely believed that the girls were taken to Cameroon. The idea of shifting between Nigeria and Cameroon is very similar to the way these AQIM-trained militants operated. Second, it was very well propagandized. The whole world began to see what happened. This was the biggest news story last May. And a third, the fact that it was a kidnapping. And as I've mentioned before, the tactic of kidnapping had been taken from the AQIM-trained Nigerians and given to the more indigenous Boko Haram movement. Now, what's very interesting about the claim of this Chibok kidnapping, and I think major news media organizations around the world reported how the leader of Boko Haram, Shekau, said, "I will sell the girls in a slave market," and so on, was that in the very beginning of that video, the leader of Boko Haram, Shekau, chants to an audience of fighters, "Dawlat al-Islami Qamat, Dawlat al-Islami Baqiya, Dawlat al-Islami Qamat, Dawlat al-Islami Baqiya," which is the slogan of the Islamic State. The Islamic State remains and the Islamic State is established. That is such a distinct Islamic State slogan that it's unlikely he would have randomly said that using the finger of monotheism during the chant. So what this suggests to me is that at the time of the Chibok kidnapping, those who at least controlled the propaganda, and Shekau, the leader himself, was likely already planning a shift or at least some type of identification with the Islamic State as early as May 2014, unless you want to argue that he coincidentally happened to say the Islamic State slogan at that time, which was about the same time that the Islamic State was actually being announced in Iraq and Syria. This is May 2014. Keep in mind, one important note is that even though Ansaru and the AQIM-trained Nigerians merged with Boko Haram, or JAS, which is its real name, as I said, the name JAS persisted. So it sort of became hard to see the influence of Ansaru via the name. But I think on an institutional level, based on these tactics, we can see the influence of the AQIM-trained Nigerians. Now, one trend that you see globally since mid-2014 is that the Sahelian AQIM factions have increasingly been shifting their allegiance towards the Islamic State. At least 5 AQIM factions have already pledged to the Islamic State. Mujau, which was very similar to Ansaru, Movement for Unity and Jihad in West Africa, which occupied Mali for a period of 2013, in coordination with AQIM, that group has also pledged to Islamic State. So the fact that a group like Ansaru, which was Nigerian-trained AQIM members, would pledge to Islamic State is completely consistent with the trajectory of other AQIM-related factions deeper into the Sahel that have since joined the Islamic State. Now, when we look at the evolution towards ISIS, there are some very visible examples about the way that the pledge from Boko Haram to the Islamic State happened that we can just see from watching videos, and I'm sure there was a lot of background discussions that are less evident. For one, Boko Haram media began taking a more professional framing. So you begin to see Boko Haram inserting Mektab al-Alami or other types of branding such as media agency, media company, media organization to professionalize the videos that it released, as you can see in these examples. Then you began to see Boko Haram choreographically copying the Islamic State. So as the Islamic State would kill a bunch of Iraqi soldiers in a line, then you would see Boko Haram killing a bunch of its enemies also in a line, one by one. You would see the Islamic State doing wheelies in a tank somewhere in Iraq or Syria, and then you would see Boko Haram capturing a tank and doing wheelies just like the Islamic State. The Islamic State would do a video destroying the Iraqi-Syria border, and then Boko Haram would do a video destroying the Nigeria-Cameroon border, using the term breaking in both cases. Islamic State would do a video shooting Shia in the head, and then throwing them into a river of blood. Boko Haram would shoot the Nigerian Civilian Joint Task Force in the head and also throwing them in a river of blood. ISIS did a video in Darna, Libya, showing a convoy of cars to prove it had control, which was an exaggeration, however. But then Boko Haram did a whole convoy of cars after that video, showing that it also had control. And even Shekau, the leader of Boko Haram, took out his military camouflage uniform, went back to being an imam, and used a lot of rhetoric and symbolism like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in October 2014. So this was some choreographic copying that became so prevalent that it seemed to be more than a coincidence, that there was actually some communications. We could go on. ISIS is very big about calling its young kids the cubs. Boko Haram also began to call its young kids the cubs. So this idea of copying was very prevalent in Boko Haram, and although there may not have been too many human contacts between the groups, there is ways to learn between groups institutionally through the mere act of copying and learning from the example from one to the other. In academic terms, if I pronounce the word right, it's mimetic isomorphism, the copying of another group and learning from it. Now, the big key for the final push towards the pledge, which you might see in other groups around the world too, is the Boko Haram establishment of a Twitter account, which was called Al-Urwa Al-Wudka, after a verse in the Quran. And while I get pushback a lot of times around the world where they say that Twitter is just a game that kids play and terrorist groups don't use, in fact, as many people know, Twitter is the platform of communication for ISIS. And as I'll talk about very briefly, ISIS set up this Twitter account either for Boko Haram or with Boko Haram. This Twitter account was notable for a few reasons. One, it was 90% in Arabic language. Nigerians generally do not speak Arabic, even Muslims, so it was directed towards an international audience. Two, the account would describe cities in Nigeria in detail, which wouldn't be necessary for Nigerians to say, Maiduguri, located near the river in Borno State, that has this many people, blah, blah, blah. But for people in Syria who've never really heard of Nigeria, this was helpful. The Twitter account was also notable because although Shekau was the leader of Boko Haram, for the first 40 days, no mention of him whatsoever. I can tell you that the reason for this was likely that those Nigerian-trained AQIM members that reintegrated with the more indigenous Boko Haram are the ones who likely spearheaded this Twitter account and likely had their remaining connections with ISIS from other former AQIM members who also would join ISIS. Sort of an interesting network. But one of the reasons why they didn't feature Shekau is they don't really like him that much. It was a merger by necessity, strategic. They didn't love Shekau, but they had to accept his suzerainty over the movement. And that's why they were probably not eager to accept him until they came to some agreement at the end to show him on this Twitter account. Based on the photos, this Twitter account was likely based on the Nigeria-Cameroon border. As I mentioned with the Chibok kidnapping, this border region was largely made of those former AQIM Nigerian members as a way to separate their area of operations from Shekau's area of operations, because again, these two internal factions are not that friendly. And the messaging of this Twitter account was also unique, because it was very humane. Unlike Shekau, who I said was a Takfiri, the indigenous Boko Haram movement, he believes in killing people like rams, as he says. But this messaging would say, if you repent, we won't kill you. If you don't fight us, we also won't kill you. Even if you're a Christian, we might not kill you unless you give us antagonism. And this showed that there was definitely a different ideological stream running this official account. Another example why I think this was an Ansaru type of account, influenced by the Nigerian AQIM members, is that they used language such as in this this Arabic there, where they called themselves the Dulat al-Islamiyya fi Bilad al-Sudan. They were already calling themselves the Islamic State in Bilad al-Sudan, in the land of Africa. This is the exact former name of Ansaru. Shekau, indigenous movement, had never been so pan-African as the AQIM-trained African Nigerians or the Ansaru movement. Moving further along with this Twitter account and the narrative that was being pushed, and again, this whole Boko Haram-ISIS pledge is most significant in terms of the narrative it creates for both groups, was that where ISIS would encourage people to also migrate to their new province in Libya, they would insert Nigeria in there. So it became apparent to me that somewhere in the Islamic State global hierarchy, you had Libya as like a first-degree province, and Nigeria was being staged to be somewhat like a second-degree province connecting via Libya to Nigeria. ISIS key media operatives, such as the former AQIM member Shaiba al-Hamad, would pre-announce tweets on the Boko Haram account, which suggested that ISIS media operatives knew about the tweets by Boko Haram before they even happened. Another example of cooperation. And the strategic effect in terms of narrative of this Twitter account was not so much that ordinary Nigerians would view it, because most Nigerians have not. However, ISIS followers were avidly tracking this account, and they were picking up the signals from this Twitter account based on the nasheeds, or Islamic songs, based on the choreography, that something was going on between Boko Haram and ISIS. And you could see it in their own enthusiastic tweets for ISIS's expansion. Without getting into too much detail, you could even see some similarities between the way that the Ansaru, or Nigerian AQIM members, pictured themselves in 2002 in Nigeria, and the way that this Twitter account began featuring fighters and interviews in 2015. And even the clothing that they wore, their language, the use of Hausa, Arabic, and English, and the professional quality. The Twitter account continued to evolve. You even saw some same camera angles. John Cantley is a British journalist turned hostage in Aleppo. In one video, they show a bird's eye view screening over him and then capturing him on the ground. And then Boko Haram did a similar video in Maiduguri, screening over the city and then capturing Boko Haram fighters on the ground, carrying out an attack. Again, the Twitter account was explaining, where is Nigeria, where is Borno, who is Boko Haram, so people could know who are in ISIS, who is your future affiliate or province. And they had the same opening Tasmiyah signals. ISIS also discussed Boko Haram in Dabiq magazine number 5, praising the Chibok kidnapping that I mentioned before, and also notably praising Philippine jihadist group kidnappings of Christians at the same time. I don't know why they really include Philippines there, but I would suggest it might be because the British-Italian ideologue Musa Sarantonio lived in the Philippines. He's been the #1 advocate for the Chibok kidnapping for the Islamic State, and maybe he actually had a role in drafting that part of Dabiq 5. Dabiq 6, ISIS said these mujahideen in Nigeria are discussing the pledge. We'll see what happens. And the group called Africa Media, which is a whole other topic that we don't have time to get into today, has, in my view, very credibly claimed that they are the ones who liaised Boko Haram to the Islamic State. In particular, one individual claimed to be an Ansar Sharia Tunisia member, who, unlike the leadership of that group, which is still pro-AQ, he said, I'm personally pro-Islamic State, and we are the ones who segued Boko Haram to al-Baghdadi. They did a series of posts, and I think they're credible, and it fits in with the broader scheme of former AQIM groups shifting towards ISIS. The final stage of the pledge to ISIS came with videos that had all of the signatures of ISIS, from everything from a heartbeat that a person would do before he gets beheaded that they would amplify in special effects, to French language. And then finally, Shekau issues a bayah, or a pledge. And later, Islamic State accepted it, and 10 different Islamic State provinces praised Boko Haram for that pledge. That is the most, in terms of the metric of enthusiasm, Boko Haram's pledge to ISIS was the most enthusiastic pledge of any group that has pledged to the Islamic State. And as Aaron Zelen noted yesterday, ISIS does communal viewings of ISIS videos. And in Libya, they showed a video of the communal viewing in Darna, Libya, or Barqa, Libya, of Shekau's pledge. So they got people in a tea house and said, here, watch Boko Haram's pledge. And they interviewed people acting very excited. Now, since the pledge, as I gear towards what is the outcome of the pledge? Interestingly, in February 2015, Nigeria had a presidential election. I think in order to look very good before the election, the then president, who lost, wanted to do a very big offensive against Boko Haram to appear strong before the election. That offensive has been largely successful to the extent that it knocked Boko Haram out of all the towns that it had occupied. Boko Haram notably began occupying those towns only after this courtship process that I just discussed began. And I think it was likely an attempt to show Islamic State that we can hold territory and we can be part of your territorially based caliphate. However, Boko Haram now controls very little territory as a result of the military offensive. It's scattered. However, it wants to portray the narrative still as part of ISIS's media team, because now it's integrated with the central media apparatus, that we still hold territory. So in this video on Eid, you see Boko Haram showing a lot of people praying, and that is a lot of people. But the purpose is to say that we have not been kicked out of the forest. We are coming soon, saying we still control territory. Another video that they issued recently says, here you can walk 5 hours under the black flag by car or motorbike. Again, trying to say we still have territory. Don't think we really got knocked out. Another video says, be patient. We're facing the Nigerian army and the African Union. Everybody knows that we're not even in the forest of Sambisa here. We're actually in a lot of towns. So Boko Haram is trying to say, we control territory. They have adopted the main ISIS narrative. Boko Haram has, in scattering from Nigeria, shifted a lot to Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. There were 4 suicide attacks in Chad in July 2015. And those notably were claimed more directly from the Islamic State core than any other Boko Haram or West Africa province attack. You can see the way that it was claimed on Twitter here. And that's, in my view, probably because the Chadian Boko Haram members or West Africa province members are closer to the Islamic State in Libya due to previous networks and reasons. So the ISIS core influence may be stronger in Chad than even in Nigeria. Another trend is that the Turkish border is getting much tougher to cross. It's not as easy as it was even in December 2014. Turkey's becoming serious about closing it. And as a result, you see increasing encouragement from the Islamic State to people who cannot make it to Syria to go to Libya. And if you can't even make it to Libya, West Africa is fine. So we might see an increasing number of foreign fighters in Libya, and that can lead to a trickle-down effect towards Nigeria. And again, these migration movements are very wide open from Nigeria to Libya. For $1,000, you can pretty much make it to Libya safely. For $600, you maybe take more risk, but you might be able to get there. The implications of a pledge like this. On the regional level, we can see that ISIS is pushing Boko Haram to expand beyond Nigeria, so it's not portrayed as a national movement, but it's portrayed as a transnational movement. It would counter ISIS's ideology for Boko Haram to stick within the Westphalian confines of Nigeria. Second is a new negotiation hierarchy, and I think this could very much affect any dialogue for the Chibok schoolgirls or for potential ceasefire with Boko Haram. It's very likely that Boko Haram is now reporting to Libya, which is then reporting to Syria, and any peace or ceasefire that is made with Boko Haram will affect the broader Islamic State brand. So Islamic State will definitely have an incentive to not have Boko Haram join a deal that can make the Islamic State look weak or hurt its image. And another implication is that if Boko Haram is now on the run as a result of the military offensive, the increased ties and trust with the Islamic State provinces in Libya, or even in Mali through former AQAM factions, could likely allow Boko Haram some more breathing room in its retreat. In the same note, if Islamic State is ever defeated in Iraq and Syria and they need to go to Plan B, which means moving to what some have called the third capital in Libya, in Sirte, then maybe it would allow more collaboration on that level. On the global level, Al-Qaeda had always talked about moving into Africa for a number of strategic reasons and a number of opportunities it saw there. Now Islamic State is moving into Africa, and in terms of its narrative and the rivalry that it has with Al-Qaeda, the pickup of Boko Haram as part of its network was very important to portraying that Africa is now for the Islamic State and we're more than Al-Qaeda. That being said, we've talked a number of times today in presentations and yesterday in presentations that Al-Qaeda is still there. And in fact, Boko Haram's shift to Islamic State might actually create a move for Al-Qaeda to try to get back into Nigeria because it lost its footing when Ansarut got defeated and then joined Boko Haram. There's still a big audience where Al-Qaeda can tell people in Nigeria, these Boko Haram guys are psychopaths, but if you want to take a step back a bit and you want to go for a less psychopathic caliphate, then come to our Al-Qaeda. And Mukhtar Belmokhtar, he's back in Al-Qaeda. He has had interests in Nigeria for a long time. He's someone that could maybe try to build up a new network in Nigeria. It's also important on a global level because the template of how Boko Haram joined ISIS could be a template that we see in other regions such as Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and so forth. Currently, ISIS's focus is on the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa. But Southeast Asia, for example, is not beyond its radar. And third, as I've mentioned, for ISIS's narrative about remaining and expanding, this pickup was very important because it shows to the world we're still here in Syria and Iraq, and not only that, we are also expanding to places such as Africa. Whether that's factual or not, the propaganda is certainly doing its best to portray that expansion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob, regarding detailed presentation about the evolution of Boko Haram. And now we invited Yassin. Please take your place.
Thank you very much. All right. A couple of months ago, there was a little article in a Jordanian newspaper, I think it was Al-Ghad, and it talked about a young Jordanian man who had 3 years ago finished his university education. He had studied business administration and wasn't able to find a job. And that although he never showed any signs of extremism or even a particular interest in religion, that he had moved into the Islamic State, to Raqqa, to get a job there. And after he arrived in Raqqa, he posted to his friends on Facebook that he was now in the caliphate and that life was good and that he had a job and he was now part of the state-building effort in the caliphate. And that really struck me because this is not the perception that we have of the caliphate in the West, that people would go there because they can pursue careers there or chances there that they feel they can't pursue in their own countries. I'm using this to start my presentation because what I'm trying to do in this presentation is I will try to drive home 2 points. And they may seem contradictory, but they are not. Point number one is the Islamic State has less money at its disposal than you may believe. Point number two is its economy still is more resilient than you would think. So let's start. Large parts of my presentation, I'm not sure, can you read all that? Is it not really?
You want us to read?
Well, I'd rather you read it than I read it out because if it's possible, I don't know. No. Is that a little bit better? Excellent. Thank you. Much of what I will be presenting here today is based on an investigation that a number of colleagues of mine and myself did last year, autumn of last year, and the results of which were published in November. It was a big team effort, 13 reporters, 7 countries, including Syria and Iraq, and we spent 4 months with this research, so it was a big enterprise. And our key question was, because the newspapers after the takeover of Mosul were full with huge, gigantic numbers about money that the IS was now, in charge of, or in possession of, rather. There was newspaper reports about $500 million sitting in the central bank in Mosul that they had now control over. The numbers that they were making off of oil allegedly were amazingly high. So we figured that maybe this is not true, or maybe we need to take a closer look at it, because none of this seems really substantiated by any good sourcing. So our idea was, let's try and get as close to the business side of the caliphate as possible, and not believe anybody else but our own sources and what we see with our own eyes. That was the entire idea. So we wanted to know, how much money does the IS make, and is the way that it makes this money sustainable? Like I said, this was published end of November last year. Things have changed since, or they haven't changed, but they have developed. So I've augmented our findings with expert interviews, with research on the jihadi internet, and I've spoken to very recently former residents of Mosul and Raqqa, because I wanted to be sure that this is still up to date. So I will first take you through the sources of income, the main sources of income, and I'll tell you one thing first. I have not, or I will not discuss donations, individual donations, because we couldn't find any convincing traces of them. So it just doesn't make any sense to dwell on that. But I'll start with oil and gas, because in standard reporting and mainstream media, this has been seen or portrayed as the main source of income. And it is definitely an important source of income for the Islamic State. Some estimates late last year said that they were probably making $3 to $8 million per day from at least 80,000 barrels per day that they were able to produce. These estimates are way too high for several reasons. The first reason is that these estimates are largely based on pre-war numbers. And the IS cannot run oil facilities with that degree of efficiency. There's proof of that. Other people have looked into, for example, the flaring of methane gas at night, which is an indicator of how much oil is being produced or is being extracted. And there's no way that the Islamic State is operating on the same level of efficiency as the Iraqi and Syrian governments have before. There's lack of market access, because the IS can't sell oil officially, which means that other people have to be used as middlemen, but they also want to make a cut. So the IS has to sell whatever oil it gets out of the earth at a discount price to people who also want to make a profit. And there's more, there's change of middlemen. We have traced the flow of oil from Syrian oil fields near to Hasakeh to the Syrian-Turkish border region and beyond. So we went to the Turkish farmers in the villages on the Turkish side of the Syrian border who sell the oil by the bottle that is brought into Syria through makeshift pipelines over the river, the Orontes River, and that we believe we can trace back to IS territory. Now, in the process of getting that money into that oil into Turkey, there's probably a chain of 6, 7, 8 merchants involved. All of them want to make a cut. So you can imagine how little of this profit ends up with the Islamic State. When we did our research in Hasakeh, we would have been able to buy a barrel of oil at the price of the IS for the price of $17. That was at the time when the world market, I think, was around $90 still. So our numbers are the numbers that, let me first add 2 other problems that they have. They have a severe lack of engineers, so they can't keep the facilities in order. They are lacking spare parts, and they can't keep up with the maintenance. So whatever they are producing now, it's bound to become even less. Plus there's, of course, the airstrikes. So our estimate for November 2014 was that they, at best, were able to produce 20,000 barrels per day. At $18, that would be $360,000 per day. So it's nowhere near those millions that they would have been able to make per day. In fact, we even found indication that there was an energy crisis in the caliphate, because whatever oil they produce, a lot of it they need for their own machinery, for the war machinery, for their own vehicles. So there wasn't much left for the citizens to use. So what we know is that in Mosul, for example, they actually imported refined gasoline from out of Syria because there wasn't enough of it in Mosul available, even though they were extracting oil there. So this is much more complicated than one would think. The second source of income, I personally believe, may be the most important one, and that's extortion. When the IS took over Mosul, and this happened wherever they took over any area, people fled, of course. People were driven out of those places, people fled. So the IS took money, valuables, stock, livestock that is, and they took houses, entire houses from people, and our estimates, I mean, there are no exact numbers, but we are talking about tens of thousands of families, perhaps hundreds of thousands of families, who have lost everything that they had to the Islamic State. We're talking about Christian families who fled Karakosh, for example, or Yazidi families, Shiite families. When we interviewed refugees who had recently fled from Mosul, we asked them to give us lists of the things that they had left behind and that they are now owned by the IS. We basically asked them, how much have you lost? The families that we spoke to were mainly Christian refugee families. They may have had more in their possession than the standard Yazidi family, but we're still talking about thousands of families. And the numbers they gave us were starting at 20,000 going up to 50,000 per family that were lost. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, just plain theft, basically. What happened in Mosul also is that the savings accounts at the banks there that were in the name of Shiites, Christians, Yazidis, and former government officials, namely of the security forces, were immediately confiscated. Nobody knows how much that is, but it's a ton of money. What exactly happened at the central bank, we could not clear up. I mean, there must have been money in that bank. The question is, to what extent was it digital money, and to what extent was it actual cash? It's hard to find that out. The central government in Baghdad has since, of course, tried to make sure that the connection of all Baghdad, of all IS states, of all banks in IS territory to the international banking system has been cut. But we assume that they still have access to that banking system through companies that they have taken over from their former owners in Mosul and elsewhere. One side note here, because that would have been subsumized under extortion, is the mystery of the slave trade. The IS itself has said several times that they have been selling Yazidi girls into slavery. We are sure that that happened. What we could not prove, even though we tried really hard by talking to people in Mosul and Raqqa, is that there ever were public slave markets. There are pictures who allegedly show those slave markets. We believe them to be fake. We think they have been taken out of a possibly Iranian TV show that we're supposedly showing something historical. We are not saying it didn't happen. We definitely say that they have made money off of human trafficking, but we don't think that they were public human slave markets where you could go and walk and see hundreds of women and buy one. The third obvious source of income is kidnap and ransom. We spoke to local victim families because in sheer terms of numbers, of course, most victims of kidnapping are local. So we spoke to one family, for example, a Christian family that had been driven out of Mosul. When the IS told them to pack their things and go, they kept the 3-year-old daughter. They just kept her. They said, you can either enter the bus now and leave with the rest of them, and our daughter stays with us, or we'll just kill all of you. So they fled, left the daughter behind, and when we spoke to them, we're still negotiating the release of their daughter, a 3-year-old hostage with the Islamic State. They demanded something around $20,000 at the time. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of cases like that, largely underreported in the West, of course, because we mainly care about Western hostages, off of which the IS can make significantly more money, of course. So as you all know, I mean, you don't have to dwell on that. You all know those cases, and you've all seen the pictures. What we have found out is that, you probably know this number as well, that the IS alone in 2015 may have made as much as 25 million out of Western hostage operations. We believe that they still hold between 20 and 40 foreign hostages. So that's like, I'd say, and I don't want this to sound in any way cynical, but that's like they have them in the bank, so to say. When they need cash, they can sell them. the way this works, we've spoken to many people involved in the kidnapping and ransom operations. The way it works is that they usually start asking for 20 million, and they end up giving the hostages away for anything between 3 to 5 million. This is the usual rate, or was the usual rate end of last year. What we also found out is that the IS has specialized cadres for these operations, who will interview the hostages, will find out personal information, will actually research them in order to assess how urgent this release may be, and how much more money can I make off of it if it's somebody who's prominent, if it's somebody who's comes from a rich background, or that sort of thing. It's interesting that all of these specialized cadres seem to be Iraqis. This is what several hostages have told us. It's also interesting that some of the hostages told us they believed that these persons had an intelligence background, which would link with the known fact that former Ba'athist elements do play a part in the Islamic State, and this is what they are good at, interrogating people and doing intelligence work. The fourth source of income, also a very, very important one, is what I would subsumize as taxation, zakat, and rent. It's probably the most important. Like I said, we can't know for sure. But here's what we found out about Mosul. In Mosul alone, tens of thousands of flats were in the possession of the state, and the state would let it to people at a subsidized rate. All of these housing schemes have been taken over, confiscated by the Islamic State. Still the same tenants living in the same flats, but their rents now go to the Islamic State. The same is true of some buildings that some mosques have been holding. Our estimate, and this is a very, very conservative one, the number may be twice or three times as high, very conservative estimate, 20,000 units, that's houses and shops, at $150 per month. That would give you anything from upwards of $3 million every month in Mosul alone, just from rents. You can be sure that similar things happen in other places as well, namely in Raqqa and wherever else they are holding a city or a town. In terms of taxes, there's conflicting information. What seems to be confirmed, I'd say, is that there is a 2.5% zakat tax in place for everything and all across the caliphate. At least at the beginning, after the takeover of Mosul, we've heard from several people that they were collecting 10% in the form of tax on capital and profits. I'm not sure this is 100% verified, but we've heard it from several sources. We also know that at that time, vans that entered the city to sell goods were charged anything between $200 and $500, depending on what they were carrying. And latest information that I've heard, this was in Al Monitor, I think, is that if you have a market stall in Mosul, you have to pay $1,500 a year, that should say, not percent, $1,500 a year to the IS, just to have your market stall there. So these are all sources of income. And they all add up. And they're all constant. They happen on a monthly basis. So this is what they can actually put in their budget. A lot has been written about money that the IS allegedly makes off of antiquities. We've really looked into that. We've spoken to several dozens of people all across the world because we wanted to find out what are the traces for that. We really wanted to see one example at least. We couldn't find one. The problem is that while we are absolutely certain that illegal excavations are taking place, we are not sure that very valuable pieces have entered the world market yet. We don't think that they are being dealt with. They may probably still be stored somewhere to cool down, let them sit for 10 years and then sell them on. We also have no proof that the IS is directly involved in the sale of antiquities. What we believe, what we know actually, is that in some archaeological sites they take a tax or a lump sum to allow people to dig there. And the networks for smuggling antiquities out of Syria and Iraq, they have been in place for decades. Those are known families. They've been living off of that forever. So this is nothing new. The only thing that's new is that the IS is making it easier for them to get to the stuff. The question is, how much do they get out of the country, and what is it that they get out of the country? According to our information, and we've spoken to, ironically, the Syrian border protection, sorry, not border protection, Peter, what's Zoll? Customs, the customs authority. And they have told us that in the year of 2014, I think there was anything between 800 and 900 cases of smuggling that they detected. And in most of these cases, the stuff that was being smuggled out of the country was basically worthless. It were single coins that are not very expensive. And there was a lot of fake material among it. So the baseline, the bottom line is, I don't think that the sale of antiquities makes up for a large amount of the IS budget. It's happening, but it's not a major thing. So what are the attempts in which the IS is trying to organize the economy in the caliphate? Because now they are ruling a large area. There's probably as many as 6 million people living under their control. And if you want to keep this going, you need to do something about the economy. There are certain fatwas in place that I find very interesting that seem to be serving the purpose of getting some kind of order into that. For example, there's one fatwa issued by the Islamic State that says that if you sell counterfeited goods, you have to say that they are counterfeited, that they are fake. Even if you sell both, if you sell the original product and the fake product also needs to be cheaper than the original product. This is the first attempt at something that is bigger and larger and very important for running any economy, namely protection of intellectual property. Even though in this case it may refer to Nike sneakers, and Nike is not is not of any concern to the IS. But the direction I think that this is going towards is that they have understood that to stabilize things, they need a degree of order and predictability and protection for somebody who wants to run a business, because there's nothing wrong with running a business, not even in a caliphate. This is why also the IS not only claims, but for all we can see, actually acts against corruption. We have known several cases in which fighters have been sentenced because they were corrupt. This is something that is not tolerated officially, which also helps the economy. What we know is that in order to keep certain facilities running, they are offering very high salaries, especially to engineers. I've heard of cases where they have offered twice the salary that somebody had before the IS came into town for helping to run an oil facility. So that's a handsome salary. Another attempt that I would subsumize as trying to organize the economy is this attempt to create their own currency. But this is largely a PR scheme. Nobody has ever seen the coins in the streets. Somebody told me yesterday, I think it was Aaron Zalen, that somebody had found out that they aren't even made of gold. So this is, excuse my English, but that's bullshit. This is not happening. There's no IS currency that's actually working on any kind of level. There are secret deals in place, at least with the Syrian regime, probably with others as well, in order to, those are deals that help both sides. The one side will not attack a certain facility, but the other side will therefore, either sell oil to them or buy back gasoline. So there is certain clandestine deals even with the Syrian government in place. As far as the oil smuggling goes, there's a degree. We are not only talking about organized crime there and the mafia. We are also talking about, I don't think there's any point in denying that. We're also talking about corrupt Peshmerga fighters who one day will stop tankers full of smuggled oil or illegal oil. On the next day, we'll let them pass through and take money for it. So that's another secret deal that's in place sometimes at least. So the question is, how strong and how resilient is the IS economy? Because when I started this presentation, I said it's more resilient than you would think it is. Common understanding among economists, and I'm not an economist, I just have read up on that, but there's some fantastic papers in place. If you're interested, I'll point you to them. Economists seem to be convinced that a state model that's based on extraction, like the IS is, cannot be sustainable. And I tend to agree after what I've seen, because there's been terrible price hikes in Mosul and Raqqa. People are saying that only the IS fighters can afford meat. Nobody can eat meat anymore. Energy has become tremendously expensive. There's still a severe lack of accountability, legal protection. So there is a degree of stability, there's a degree of activity, but all economists that have covered the IS economy so far seem to agree that what we are seeing now, it's probably a high point. There's no way that this is growing. There's no way that this is going to be a well-off state. This is going to go down the drain in the long run. They cannot maintain this, especially if they can't expand anymore. Because expansion means new sources of money that you can make off of extraction. But at least that seems to have been taken care of by the coalition airstrikes. There's no expansion in sight that would be meaningful in any kind of way. So this is why Eckhard Wirtz, who's really written a great paper about that, talks about the Ponzi scheme. But when I spoke to him recently in preparation of this talk, he also said that it is more resilient than I thought it would be, and maybe we have to reconsider some of our theories. Hansen, Lewis, and Shapiro, who also wrote a great article in Terrorism Perspectives, also say that it's not sustainable unless, and this is an interesting point, unless the IS stops being the IS. It would need to become a very different kind of state. It would need to allow for things that they can't allow right now for ideological reasons for this to become more stable, economically speaking. I don't see signs of that really, nothing meaningful anyway. So I guess what I'm saying when I sum this all up is there's less money from oil and gas than most people believed. There's more money from extortion and taxes than estimated. But the IS economy is more resilient than expected because it hasn't simply broken down yet. However, only sustainable if the caliphate